came as a bride, I was new to the town, except knowing that my ancestors had been here and settled the town in 1635, and out of the 12 founding families that we know of, there perhaps were more, but we don't know their names. We know of 12. And out of those 12, I think I can claim descendancy to about 6 of them. The Wheelers were one, and I married a Wheeler, so I married one of my own relatives without knowing it. And then when I had time, I spent my spare time just wandering through the old burying grounds to see who I could find for my ancestors. And I found a great many, and the more I found, the more exciting it got. So that is how I got the interest in the burying grounds in Concord. And of course, Sleepy Hollow is one of the most famous in the country, with all the important people that are buried here. And so I have just always had a great love for these old burying grounds, and a personal touch because they're my ancestors. A good place to start is in the very left-hand corner of what we now call Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. You will find a nice little building which originally was the North Center Schoolhouse in 1849, where the children from Concord Center went to school. And it was a well-built structure, and so there was no need to tear it down. And it had been used for several things. It had been used for the hearse house, for one thing. And then people thought they needed a little chapel for religious funerals. And so, for a while, it was an Episcopal chapel. And then it just became a mortuary chapel. And it is now being used as the building for the Concord Cemetery Department, where the lady, she's a young girl who is in charge of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery Department. And but it's still a typical one-room schoolhouse if you look inside. And we like to keep it decorated with flowers. One of our committee members tends to that by himself, and we're very grateful that he keeps it looking well. Now, the retaining wall is interesting. In 1867, we had a jail, the county jail, where Henry Thoreau was incarcerated the afternoon that he was arrested by the sheriff, Sam Staples, He'd been warned and warned and warned about this. There was a $2 tax bill that he had not paid from the town of Concord, but he refused to pay it, and he said, I will not pay that bill because it does not represent what I believe in. It will go to aid a war. I do not believe in war. It will go to support slavery, and I do not approve of slavery. So I will not pay the tax. And the sheriff said, well, Henry, you've got to pay the taxes if you're going to live in Concord, and therefore I'll have to put you in jail. And he knew full well he'd be put in jail, but he said, okay, go ahead and do it. I'm not going to pay the tax. So he did. So he went to jail and spent the night there. Well, the next morning, the word got out that Henry Thoreau was in jail. And supposedly, his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson went to the jail to check it out for himself. And he saw Henry inside there, and he said, Henry, what are you doing in jail? And Thoreau's reply was, Waldo, what are you doing outside jail? Why aren't you supporting this too? Then his Aunt Maria, who couldn't bear to have her son in jail, put on some dark, all her black clothes and a black veil and black gloves so no one would recognize her, went down with the $2 in her hand and paid the tax herself so that he would be released from jail. But he was cross. He said, Aunt, you have spoiled my purpose. So that's the story of the night Henry Thoreau spent in jail. All right, now the day came when that jail had to be torn down. And so they, waste not, want not, of course, they never threw anything away in those days. And it was dismantled, but some of the granite blocks from its walls were made very good wall support for this retaining wall that you will see here along facing the street. Just about the very first stone in the whole of Sleepy Hollow is that of Louisa Dunbar, who was Henry Thoreau's grandmother. And at the time that Henry died, the family did not have a family lot, but grandmother's lot was available. And so this is where Henry Thoreau was originally buried, and other members of his family too, as they died. Then it got down to just the last sister, Sophia. There had been 6 people here, 2 girls, 2 boys, and the parents. And so Sophia was the last of the 6 to still be alive. So at that point, she had acquired a bit of money and was able to buy a burial lot for her own family. So at that point, she had them all interred and, no, uninterred, you say, deterred, whatever. And you'll now find him on Arthur's Ridge with all 6 of them up there. So this was the early beginning of his whole family. Uncle Charlie there in the corner was, well, he was kind of an Uncle Charlie that every family ought to have one of. He was a bachelor, but he was very supportive of Henry and dearly loved.
Hillside Tomb. The only tomb in the new burying ground was built high on the hillside. Constructed of granite, it has 8 sections, each with a slate nameplate on the front.
in this era, this is about in the 1840s, 50s. If you did not have a body to bury here, but you wanted a memorial of the person, you laid a table tomb, which is obviously just what they are, like a table. But it means that there are no bodies buried underneath. They're also called a cenotaph. And the writing on each table tells about the person. But unfortunately, weather and snow and frost and hail and rain have erased the wording, so it is very difficult to read what it said. I found out that I believe the one in the middle was one of the ministers of the church, of the meeting house. There was only one church in those days, the Concord Meeting House. In the first half of the 19th century, horizontal slabs raised on legs were popular memorials to ministers and other important citizens. And one of these memorials is for Reverend Percy Goodwin, assistant in 1830 to Ezra Ripley, who was the pastor of the First Parish Church in those days. Now, he is buried elsewhere, so the town of Concord laid this tablestone for him, and I'm not able to identify the other people. If you went to the Concord Library, there is a map of all the names, and you would be able to identify it if you really wanted to know who they were. The old cannon. It was from a ship from an 1812 man-of-war. But it is a memorial to the Concord men who fought in the Civil War. And so it was installed by the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the principal organization of the Union Army. You'll notice that most of the graves in this area have Scandinavian names because there was the Irish immigration who all came in quantities to the town of Concord during the Irish famine in the 1840s, and a short time later it was also a colony of Scandinavian people from Sweden and Norway, and you'll find their names, Nelsons and Beckvolds, not quite like the Irish people, sort of clustered together. And the Norwegian Scandinavian people didn't seem to cluster particularly, but they all were buried together in this area. This was called the Scandinavian end.
And this says baby.
A baby, yeah. If the parents had money enough to buy a tombstone. Many of them did not. And as a matter of fact, there is on the very far corner, the very edge of Sleepy Hollow, against the stone wall, the last stone wall, there is an area for unnamed babies. If they died at birth, in other words.
Yeah.
And their parents couldn't afford to bury them, they were buried, gave a proper burial in the Sleepy Hollow. Prudence Ward was not anyone that most people in Concord knew, but we include her here because if you're into the Thoreau Society, and the Thoreau family, you realize that she is significant in the family history. Henry Thoreau, as you know, was never married. And people say, well, did he ever have a love affair? And the answer is, yes, he did. He was very much in love with a young girl named Ellen Sewell. And to the extent that he asked her to marry him. And she said yes. But then went home and told her father. And her father said a loud no, because he felt the family was too radical for her to get involved with that family. As a matter of fact, it was at a second take on the story because his brother John also asked the same pretty Ellen Sewell to marry him. And she also said yes, and went home and told her father, and he loudly said no. So neither boy ever got Ellen Sewell. However, Prudence Ward was Ellen Sewell's grandmother, and she lived as a boarder. Mrs. Thoreau ran a boarding house for the income for the family, besides their pencil making. And her old friend, Prudence Ward, I think from Worcester, came and boarded for quite a while with the Thoreau family on Main Street, and that's why she was buried in Concord. So next, we're still right on Bedford Street, the main avenue that is following the stone wall. And this is the grave of Captain Artemus Wheeler. Now, nobody ever heard of him, but if you hear the story of his life, you will recognize who he was. He was a gunsmith right here in Concord, had a shop right down on the Mill Dam, and making his guns. He fooled around with them in his spare time and came up with a revolving chamber that he thought was a very great idea. And so he applied for a patent on it. Well, at that same time, he became ill and eventually died. And so that was the end of his success. But in the meantime, a man by the name of Colt knew about his invention, and he got hold of it and developed his own Colt guns, and now it is the famous Colt revolver company. But Artemus Wheeler was the one who really invented the idea and died without any glory whatsoever. Here we have an original Indian mortar. And today, happily, that it's been raining lately, it is full of water. And the story is that it is dedicated to Ed Neely, who was alive in Henry Thoreau's time. Ed was an older man, but he would, and Henry Thoreau, would go walking together in the woods, and he would tell Thoreau all the things he knew about it. And he had discovered this Indian mortar, and he told Henry that he wanted that to be his gravestone when he died. So Henry saw to it that it was his burial place, so that the birds could always have a place to get a drink of water and have a bath. Of course, it doesn't work in drought time, but that was the idea. And you can see it is an carved out Indian mortar where they ground their corn for cornmeal and their herbs for their medicines. Any food that had to be ground with a pestle. when we talk about women's lib, Anne French was one of the first woman liberals in Concord. She was born in 1878, but she was still alive when I knew her. And at the bottom of her gravestone it says, first woman licensed to drive an automobile in America. So that's her claim to fame. Now, here we are in the Pines, which is a newer section of the Sleepy Hollow, where most of the graves are flat to the ground. And Catherine K. Davis was a very famous lady in Concord. She was the music director at Concord Academy for many years and a resident here in Concord. But she is the lady that is credited for having written the familiar Christmas carol, The Little Drummer Boy. Someone else tried to claim the same glory that he had written The Little Drummer Boy, which was not true, and she had to go to court to settle the case, but she won. Now, Allan French is one of Concord's very, not important, but a good historian. He took Concord history to his heart and wrote little periodicals and informative pamphlets and so on about Concord history, and wrote a little booklet. It wasn't a big one, probably a paperback, but called Historic Concord, and it speaks very well for the history of the town from 1870 through. He was born in 1870, but through that turn of the century period, he was a very important and fine gentleman. Now, the Pritchard gates are the main gates of the Sleepy Hollow, which today stand proud and are very beautiful. In 1891, when the Sleepy Hollow had been expanded, there a very philanthropic man. He was a philanthropic citizen, had a lot of money, and wanted to contribute his part. And so he had gates built at that spot, and they are still called the Pritchard Gates. But then the day came that when during World War I, when the government was calling for scrap metal, and they needed all the metal they could get to melt into cannons, I suppose, and military needs. And so, apparently without anyone's permission, the then caretaker of the cemetery gave the gates to the government to be melted into cannons. And the townspeople didn't know much about it. So it was kind of a surprise to everyone. So for years, many years, there were no gates whatsoever. And you just drove right in and drove right out. However, that got to be a problem because in the 30s and 40s, kids were taking advantage of the free parking space and after dark activities. And obviously, that it was getting to be a problem for the cemetery people. So the cemetery committee voted to replace the gates and have them locked. So there are now 4 locked gates at night, and that has stopped the problem. This is being restored, believe it or not. But the committee fell apart, and so the work progress ceased. It's going to be cleaned. It has already been repaired. It was sinking. It's 100 years old, over 100 years old that it's been standing here. And the back part of it was sinking into the ground. So that has all been reinforced now. And hopefully it won't sink again for another 100 years. But it is one of the most famous statues in the country because it was done by Daniel Chester French, the man who did the very first thing he ever did as a young man at age 22 was the Minuteman statue at the Old North Bridge, because he was a Concord boy, and that was his first production. And his last was the seated Lincoln in Washington, D.C. So he obtained worldwide recognition. And this was one of his own favorites. It is called Morning Glory, M-O-U-R-N, meaning sad glory. And it is the angel of death guarding the graves of these three brothers who all died during the Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers to make up his army, all the young men in Concord gathered together. I think there were something like 70 of them, to form a group of their own to go off to fight in the Civil War. And it was a grand occasion. The town just called a holiday. They had a big banquet in the Middlesex Hotel for anybody in town, especially the boys. And then there was a parade to lead them off to the railroad station, where a special car had been sent out on the train to pick them up and take them to Washington, D.C. to join the Army. At that time, there were 4 boys in the Melvin family, and they all tried to sign up. The 3 did, and the 4th one was not old enough. He was still 15, and he couldn't pass the test, so he had to wait till his 16th birthday. But that was only a few months later, and he did join them. So all 4 of the Melvin boys fought in the Civil War, but only one came home, and that was James. One of them died of his wounds on the battlefield at Petersburg. One died in a hospital of, I think, a disease or an injury of anyway. And the 3rd one died in Andersonville prison, the hellhole of the war, which was very sad. But the 4th one came back to Concord, and he became quite well-to-do in his lifetime. So he ordered his friend, Daniel Chester French, the boy he'd grown up with here in Concord, to do a memorial to his fallen brothers. So this is what French produced himself. The laurel leaves in her left hand are the symbol of victory. And if you can see her wings draping down behind her. And if you make out, very difficult to see, but her shroud is an American flag. You can see parts of a stars on the top of it there. So it is one of the, and when Dan French was asked of all his 50 more famous statues that he had built, had sculpted during his lifetime, which one did he like the best? He would always say Morning Victory, because he knew the boys. He'd grown up with them. The Pope family were, this is just a good example of what a mausoleum would have been. The wealthier families who wanted their own privacy would have a private mausoleum for themselves. And the Pope family were very prominent and wealthy people in town. They are in complete charge of it themselves. The cemetery committee does not have any jurisdiction over who goes into the Pope family. They control it themselves. Now, the Sleepy Hollow receiving tomb was a very important part of the workings of the cemetery committee during the winter, because before snowplows, our automation that takes care of all these modern conveniences, when it was just a horse and plow, snowplow, during the winter, when the ground was frozen solid and snow was deep in the cemetery, there was no way you would bury a person who died in the middle of January. So they had the receiving tomb, which was close to the street. It wasn't too far in, and they could get that far in, but they would not try to go any further. And the ground being frozen, they couldn't dig anyway, so they would just put the people in the receiving tomb for the winter until spring thawed up the ground, and then they would bury them in the spring. All right, now as for Franklin Sanborn, he was a very important person. Whether you liked him or not was something else. He had a strange personality, but he was a devoted, ardent worker for things that he believed in. Anti-slavery was one of his strongest points. But he was a teacher. He had his own school. He did not agree with the public school systems, so he had his own school, as did Henry Thoreau and his brother had a private school of their own to improve the education of children in Concord. And he had a very fine school, and to this day the house is still there, and if you walk into the living room, you will find the blackboards are still on the wall, which was his classroom. And the families that I have ever known who lived there are very gracious to let you mark with chalk on their walls. He wrote a great deal. He was a reformer. He got into prison reform, realized the terrible conditions under which prisoners were living. He was an abolitionist and a transcendentalist, one of the strongest transcendentalists. Actually, the thing he is noted for in Concord is that he was one of John Brown's own friends and a member of his little colony of friends called the Secret Six. Frank Sanborn had invited John Brown to come to Concord to give some speeches about his abolitionist beliefs, anti-slavery. He came twice, and to the extent that he lived in Kansas, so that was a long trip for him in those days, but he did come because he knew Concord was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that everyone in Concord, it was an anti-slavery town. And after he had been here and met Henry Thoreau and his brother, he sent two of his daughters here to go to their school. And they lived with the Thoreau family while they were here as students. Well, one day, this Secret Six business, friends, supporters of John Brown, and only they knew what his own secret plans were for demolishing slavery. So when word got back to Washington that this Secret Six was going on, and they found that Frank Sanborn was one of them, and they knew where he lived, so the federal marshals were sent to his house to arrest him and take him to Washington for questioning. Well, his sister was living with him at that time, and when they went to the front door, rang the bell, it was his sister who answered the bell. And immediately she sized up the situation as to what was going on. And Frank was upstairs at the time, but came down, and they spotted him and, of course, tried to catch him and get him into their buggy and take him away. But Frank had long, strong legs, and he just fought them off and braced himself against the side of the carriage so that he would not be put inside it, and they were having a real struggle with him. In the meantime, neighbors were all gathering because they heard all the commotion, and somebody had a broomstick and was frightening the horses, making them rear up and getting them all excited. And Frank's sister knew that Judge Hoar lived just across the lawn and out on Main Street within sight of their house, and she sent one of the neighbor boys over to fetch him quickly and have him come and see the situation. And he brought with him a writ of habeas corpus, and he served a writ of habeas corpus to the federal marshals, which meant that they could not take him bodily from the spot, and so they had to leave town without Frank Sanborn. And the next morning there was a very short trial at the Middlesex court where he was exonerated from having done anything wrong. But it was one of Concord's big days. I've heard it described as the second North Bridge episode. And he also was a biographer of Henry Thoreau, one of Thoreau's best friends, and was always a newspaper, always writing things for the newspapers. Okay, so now Daniel French, of course, he was the sculptor for the famous Minuteman statue at the Old North Bridge, but also for the Melvin Memorial statue, the Mourning Victory. She is the angel of death guarding the graves of these three brothers who all died during the Civil War. And you know, out at Dan French has had his summer shop, his summer studio, out in the Berkshires in Stockbridge, and it's still there, and it's a museum now where you go to enjoy the building. But he had a little railroad track, or a little trolley track, that went from the inside room, and the wall opened up and with big doors like a barn door, and he could roll the statue out into the sunlight. And when he did that, he found that he'd made a mistake, because her hand, being held up like this, shaded her face from the, and people couldn't see her face. So he went back in and reversed it and put her hand this way. But Dan French himself had lived here. He wasn't born here, but his father was a judge, and he came and moved here to Concord when Dan was, I suppose before his teens, I think, just getting into his teens. And he made friends with all the young people of the neighborhood, including the Alcott girls and the Hawthorne girls and that group of people. And it was May Alcott, who was the artist of the Alcott family, and had classes for people here in town, and Dan French was one of her students. And she realized that she gave him a ball of clay one day and said, "Make me something." He was very young, and he produced, I say it was a frog, but some other people say it was something else. Doesn't matter. Whatever he made impressed May very much, and she realized that he had great talent for sculpting, and so he should be urged to continue his sculpting, and she saw to it that his parents sent him to a school in Boston where he trained under a very fine sculptor there. And so when it came time for the centennial celebration at the bridge of the Revolutionary War, the town wanted a memorial put at the bridge to mark this important event. And they called on Dan French to see if he would do a sculpting for them. And he produced what is now the Minuteman statue at Old North Bridge. So that was his first work that he ever did at the age of 22. And then went on to do at least 50 important works in the meantime, ending up with his final work was the seated Lincoln in Washington, D.C., in memory of Abraham Lincoln. And that was a great accomplishment. So he was one of Concord's most famous people, and he is buried at his own request, picked out the grave site himself, which is up on not Arthur's Ridge, but another ridge where he could almost look down on his morning victory. Did you hear about that? Yes, okay. Well, this is a bit of a climb for people who aren't aware of it, but you have to realize that we're on top of the esker, and that's what eskers are all about, very steep sides. Well, I always have to have a minute to get my breath, because it is a steep climb. But here we are on Arthur's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow in Concord, Massachusetts. Not Tarrytown, New York. People do confuse the two names. We are both Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, but this being Concord. Now, as perhaps you know or don't know, all these famous authors lived as neighbors, and so they are buried as neighbors. And all right here in this one short span of ground, we have all the greats. Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and on we go. So the very first one we come to is Henry Thoreau. And number one, most people are surprised if they have no idea of what Arthur's Ridge is all about, is that Henry Thoreau's own grave is nothing more than this little stone right here that says Henry. And the other stones are his siblings and his parents. So there were 4 children in this family, 2 boys and 2 girls. And John Thoreau was the first one, and Henry his brother. Then the two girls were Helen and Sophia. And so they are, if you count them out, you find them all right here. None of them married, so there are no descendants from this family whatsoever. There are other Thoreau families because John Thoreau, the father, had brothers who had children. And so there are still Thoreau descendants from the family, but not from Henry directly himself. And, you know, his motto was simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. So here it is in his gravestone, simplicity. You notice that it's almost covered with artifacts from the woods, from nature. Anything that is God's work is appropriate, an appropriate way to honor Henry. So that is why people coming here want to add something from their life to his. So even a little stone is an emblem of someone else's life that they are celebrating with Henry, or a pine cone. And I've never, ever in my whole life been up here when there wasn't something, a wildflower or a stone or a cone or some form of nature on his little stone. Now right across the lane here is the next family of the Hawthornes, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now Nathaniel was a very shy man. Very shy. He didn't want any publicity drawn to himself, and therefore not even Nathaniel is on his stone, just the word Hawthorne. And people get confused. Why does he have two tombstones? It is because this is the headstone, and that is the footstone, which indicates where his body lies. Now, he had a wonderful wife named Sophia Peabody, one of the famous Peabody sisters of Salem. And being a very shy young man as he was, she did a great deal to bring him out and to give him confidence and to make him feel more comfortable in society, although he never really ever got over it. But she was his best friend, and she did a great deal to help him develop his career. Well, Nathaniel died in 1864, and that caused great grief to the family. And Sophia and her children were so lonesome in the wayside where they lived down on Lexington Road that they just weren't happy living in the house without him. So they just took off and went to London, where they had lived earlier in their lives, and where Nathaniel was a, I'm not sure of his title, but when Hawthorne was in college, I think it was either his roommate or at least a college friend was Franklin Pierce, who eventually became the President of the United States. And he felt he had great fondness for Nathaniel and offered him the job of, well, being in the embassy, an ambassador of some sort to from the United States to England. So that is why they lived in London for 7 or 8 years while he was in the service of the President of the United States. But then they came back and spent the rest of their lives in Concord, except when Nathaniel died. Then Sophia decided to go back to London because she couldn't stand being so lonesome without him. So they did. And one by one, the children came back to the States. Rose became a nun and started a hospital, which is still in existence, for poor female cancer patients. just poor women who weren't getting any care whatsoever, didn't have any money to help themselves, and this is what her hospital is all about, and it still remains in the little town of Hawthorne, New York. They named the town after Rose. Now, the two little stones behind, you see, Hawthorne himself is here, but there are two little stones and a little stone in the middle. That was Rose's own son. She had a very sad time. She married, but her husband became an alcoholic, and that was not happy. Then she had this little boy that she adored, and he died when he was only 5. So, not having any other place for him to be buried, he was put with his grandfather just at the other side of Nathaniel's own stone. Now, the next ones are Sophia and Una, as if they were here. Well, the story is very interesting. They were still in England when they died, and this was in 1872, I believe, 73, when Sophia died. And but in those days, there was no way to get a body back to the United States from England. It was just not done. And so she was buried in Kendall Green, right in the city of London. And a few years later, Una, her first daughter, who had been born here in Concord at the old manse when they were honeymooners, and she died. So both of them were put together in Kendall Green, London, and have been there ever since. Now, that was 140 years ago. But this year, just this last summer, a very nice thing happened. The sisters of this convent that she started on her own accord for female cancer patients got very concerned about the fact that here was poor Nathaniel all by himself here in Concord, and Sophia and Una way over and across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was time they got together. So they saw to it that the two bodies were reinterred and brought here to this country in one, we call it a bone coffin. It's just a small box containing the remains of both the women together. And we had a delightful ceremony on a beautiful day this past summer. And that is what all the flowers are about. They were planted here the day of it was a reincarnation, so to say, about getting the family back together again. And the whole town of Concord is just happy that all this happened, and it just seems so right to have Nathaniel and his family back together again. These two little graves here were two little granddaughters. They were sons of, the Hawthornes had 3 children. Una, the first one, was born in the old manse and never married and stayed with her mother till she died. Second was Rose, who became the nun and did her part for women's cancer. And the third one was Jason. And Julian, that's his name, not Jason. He had 6 children, but 2 little girls died as infants, so they were put here too with their grandfather. And that's what the 2 short spaces are about. So it's a happy story, and everyone in Concord feels that it was overdue, and we wish it had been had happened before. Then we just go right across the street. Remember, these were all neighbors who lived together, and they're all buried together. So this is the big name, the Alcott family. Louisa May Alcott's family. And all of them are represented here. simply with simple headstones, as you see the same with the Thoreau family. And you have to know what their names were to identify the abbreviations, just the initials. Such as ABA would have been Amos Bronson Alcott, ABA, his father. And Marmee, you can hardly see, but it was Abigail May Alcott. And then Elizabeth, who was Beth in the story, and Louisa, LMA, of course, is Louisa herself. But she also she was a nurse in the Civil War, and so she has an American flag to show her service during the Civil War. And special little, although they're fake roses, they're symbolic of the what is now the Orchard House. Keep flowers on her grave. Then Anna, the fourth, the oldest child, if you look to the west there, you'll see a double loop for all the other stones are just one curve, but there is one with a double curve, and that is for Anna and her husband, John Pratt. So they're all represented here in one way or another, and with the family headstone in the middle. The LMA is Louisa May Alcott, but the government, that's why she has a flag, they put, or maybe the town, I'm not sure, put the Louisa May, Louisa M, to identify her specifically. He was one of the town fathers in Concord, and John Shepherd Keyes, a very important family in the history of the town. Very aristocratic people, and with a long history of ancestors here, and had great pride in the town. And it was John Shepherd Keyes who he called himself, or the town called him, the father of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, because it was his idea in the first place to start a beautiful cemetery for Concord greats. And he was a little bit self-centered, I suspect, but credits himself with having done most of the work to establish Sleepy Hollow. So he does deserve a great deal of consideration. When he died, they just put him here, and his stone was just like everybody else's. And but he ordered this himself because, as I started to say, he had had such a sad life, losing his father when he was only 8, and then growing up so poor. But every single one of his 4 strong brothers graduated from Harvard College. Their mother just worked her fingers to the bone to keep them together and to get enough money for the first child to go to Harvard. And then once he had graduated, he would work and work and work to get his second brother through Harvard, and so on and so on. So all 4 of the strong boys in the family all graduated from Harvard College. That's how Emerson himself was a Harvard graduate. There was a 5th brother who was mentally retarded, and his stone is here. Robert Bulkley was the retarded boy. They called him Bulkley. and he lived to be 53 years old. And it's lovely what it says on his stone. He was faithful over a few things. What he couldn't do much, but what he could do, he did very well, and he was faithful. And Henry Thoreau took him under his wing, and after Emerson died, and Thoreau saw to it that Bulkley was well cared for. He lived on a farm out in Littleton all the rest of his life and did what he could for mankind. Now, another important person here is Aunt Mary Moody, right here. Aunt Mary Moody was a spinster. She never married, but she was the uncle to all these Emerson children and did her part as she could to guide them through their lives. And it was Aunt Mary Moody who had more influence on Henry Thoreau, on Emerson's life than anyone else, more than either of his parents, because she said he must be a minister. It had been a family tradition. 7 generations of Emerson men had been ministers, and he must follow the family traditions, which he did, but only for a short time, because he graduated from Harvard Divinity School and was a practicing Unitarian minister. And while he was preaching up in Concord, New Hampshire, he met a very lovely, beautiful, inspiring girl named Ellen Tucker, and fell madly in love with her, and they were married and had a beautiful life together, but for only 18 months, because Ellen, like everyone else, had consumption, and Emerson knew this when they were married, that she had consumption, and she wouldn't live long, but they were married anyway. And then when she died, he was devastated. It was just heartbreak to him. So he took a trip to Europe to get over his sadness and rethink his life. And when he came back, he had decided to give up the ministry and not try to be a minister anymore, and just devote his life to writing and lecturing, which he did. So, when we get to the other side, I'll tell you the rest of the story of Ellen Tucker.
Okay.
And we are in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at the grave of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, we started on the other side where all the stones are facing to the north, but we come around this south side in order to see Emerson's own stone, because when he died, he was just put in the family group with an ordinary stone that matched everyone else's. But all his old cronies here in Concord thought that he deserved something different from everyone else's graves. So they made themselves a committee of 3 or 4, like the John Shepherd Keyes would have been one of them, and probably Ezra Ripley, who was his grandfather, and assigned themselves the job of finding an appropriate stone that would represent Emerson and his life. And they found this rose quartz stone up in a pasture in New Hampshire, and they all agreed that would be the appropriate stone. First, because of its unusual beauty, and on a rainy day, the pink really shows quite nicely there. And also, you realize it rises above the other stones, as he rose above all other people in Concord in his transcendental thinking and all his philosophy and his writings. Now, I told you that he had fallen so madly in love with this girl named Ellen Tucker from Concord, New Hampshire. But she died, and that was a dreadful part of his life. He just never got over the sadness of losing Ellen, and even at the end of his life, he was mostly out of it and had perhaps what we would call Alzheimer's disease. But he told one of his friends just before he died that he had always loved Ellen. And Lydia knew that, and she was very understanding about it. So eventually he married the second lady, Lydia Jackson from Plymouth. And she was had never thought she would be married. She intended to be an old maid, but they were married, and even at the late age, she was nearly 40 when they were married, and then she proceeded to have 4 children for Mr. Emerson, and so she was a noble lady. And if you realize the stone on to the left of Emerson's is her stone with tulips on it, because she loved flowers in her gardens. And it was Henry Thoreau who took care of her gardens for a lot of the time. And that was symbolic of her life. But when she had her 4 children, when she found she had the first daughter, she herself named the daughter Ellen Tucker Emerson, after Emerson's first wife. So you can see she was a very understanding, wonderful woman. And this daughter, Ellen, was one of Concord's famous people too. She never married. She just made sure that her parents were taken care of and saw them through, and stayed in the house until she died. Usually because the first daughter, the oldest daughter, would be taught to spin. And so she would be the spinster in the family. Yeah. And then each daughter, as they came along, would have be in charge of something else, the weaver or the... and usually the first daughter, it just seemed to be a tradition that the first daughter never did marry. She was and she was called the spinster because she was the spinner. But she was supposed to take care of mother and father until they died and not have any life of her own, which is very sad. Well, things of nature, because that was his transcendental thinking, you know. God is to nature as nature is to man, as man is to God. And without nature, we wouldn't have God. Without nature, we wouldn't have man. Without man, we wouldn't have nature, so forth. X is to Y as Y is to Z. Now, while we're right here, just across the street from the Emersons, is Mrs. Lothrop. Daniel was the father, of course, but Harriet was the lady who wrote the children's series of the Five Little Peppers. And people my age grew up with the Five Little Peppers. They were like the Bobbsey twins and the Tom Sawyer, the Tom Swift series for boys. And so she was an author by herself, but she was a very benevolent lady, and her daughter, she left, they bought the Wayside because Nathaniel Hawthorne had lived there, and they admired him. So when it was up for sale, Dan Lothrop, her father, bought the Wayside, and so she owned it. And then when she was old and getting ready to die, she didn't want anything to happen to it. She wanted it to be taken care of. So she set up a fund and stuck with it until it was taken over permanently by a good agency that would not destroy the house and would keep it in good shape. So we thank her for our present day wayside. That if it hadn't been for her, the house would have been torn down or sold or whatever. Now see, everyone brings little touches of love and honor, and even on Margaret Lothrop's grave, little stones and leaves from nature. She also started the CAR. The DAR, of course, is the Daughters of the American Revolution. The SAR is Sons of the American Revolution. And she started the CAR, Children of the American Revolution. And every year, these children come on an anniversary pilgrimage and put a wreath on her grave. Well, here's Sarah Alden Ripley. Yep, this is her, right here. Wife of, oh, all right, Sam. Sam was Ezra's son. But she was the lady who, she was self-educated. She never had to learn things. She just had a knack for knowing how to do things. And an artist at the time, maybe even Henry Thoreau, described her, went to visit her one afternoon, and her husband had a private school for boys in Waltham, and Sarah Ripley was a very self-educated person, but she could read Greek and speak Latin, and just an amazing person, self-educated, and she made a very good tutor for her husband's pupils who weren't getting enough out of their education to get into Harvard, and she would tutor them till they could. But at the same time, she had a family of 5 or 6 kids of her own, and always a baby to rock in the cradle. So here she was when Henry Thoreau went to visit her, shelling peas with her fingers, rocking the cradle of her child, who was fussy, with her foot, and at the same time tutoring a student in his Latin and Greek, sitting on the sofa. The Monroe family, father and son, and William was the father. Yes, they were both William Monroe, and the father was the first man in the United States to manufacture pencils. Up until this time, all the pencils in this country had been imported from Germany. And people by now were getting into this experimenting and expanding their minds and their products and their industries. And he learned how to make pencils. And he actually had the first pencil manufactory of anywhere in the United States. And that is why John Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau's father, picked up on that, and he learned how to make pencils, and he had the pencil factory. And that was the industry of Henry David Thoreau's family, and they all worked in their little shop and made lead pencils. Next one, you can't pass this point without talking about Ephraim Wales Bull.
Yes.
The man who developed the Concord grapes. They were for wine, and actually it was Ephraim Wales Bull who saved the country of France and their wine harvest. One year, a disease just ran through
Some kind of blight.
a blight through the vineyards of France, and it was devastating to the wine industry. They were not getting their wines. And once they got hold of a piece of the Concord grape that Ephraim Wales Bull had developed, it stopped the blight and saved the crops of the wine vineyards.
I never knew that.
And the country of France, I believe, paid tribute to Ephraim Bull. We're told that I think it's 97% of all the grapes, of all the wines in the world, have a strain of Concord grape in them. Something to do with the fermenting process is in the Concord grapes that was not in other grapes. I don't know the technical explanation, but I do know that he is credited with having saved the wine industry. But you realize that a Concord grape is different from other grapes.
Yeah.
Other grapes you just eat in your fingers and eat it all. But a Concord grape, you kind of squeeze it. And I don't chew the blue skins because they can be kind of sour if you chew them up. So I just squeeze out the centers and discard the skins. And I think that is where that secret ingredient is, that is in the Concord grapes that isn't in other grapes. Now, Ephraim was not a farmer at all. He was a city boy. He'd been born in Boston, and his father had been a gold. You pounded it. It came in a sheet, and you pounded it to the thinness that you wanted it.
Paul Revere was there.
Yep. Yes, both gold and silversmiths. Revere was, as well as his father. However, Ephraim, that's what he did for a living. Just pounded gold, and all that time all the gold dust was just getting into his nostrils and his lungs, and he was sick. And his doctor said, Ephraim, you're going to die if you keep rolling that gold. Give up your job, get out in the country, and get some fresh air, which he did. So he came out here to Concord and found a little farm for sale and on Lexington Road, and he bought it. And for something to do, he would wander up on the hillsides and gather wild grapes that were growing up there. Well, he began to experiment with growing them in his own gardens, and he would try breeding, mixing the kinds together. And for 20 years, he just experimented on growing a nice new grape, and after 20 years, he developed what we call the Concord grape. And he got a big prize for it at the Harvest Fair that year. And from then on, people started getting interested in his Concord grape, and he was so generous, he would, if anyone showed interest, he would just cut off a piece of the vine and give it to them. And they would take it home, and they would be growing Concord grapes. And sooner or later, he had used up all his vines and hadn't charged a penny for any of this, and he was a pauper, and he died a pauper. His friends, like Emerson and his neighbors, had to pay for his funeral because he was really a pauper. So that is why on the town, now the big rock was put there by the town, and the smaller rock seems to be his nephew. It's not his grave at all. And the town put in the big rock. If you can see, there's a magnificent cross in white granite through the rock. It doesn't show in this light, but that's why it was chosen. That's supposed to be a good luck charm. But it says, if you can't read it from here, He sowed, S-O-W-E-D. Others reaped, meaning that he did all the work and others reaped the money. William Wheeldon is this man right here, and he was the Bunker Hill man. You see this little Bunker Hill monument right here?
Bunker Hill Monument?
Yeah.
didn't notice that.
And one over there, and one in that corner, and one in that corner. So, because that was what he did. He was the chairman of the Bunker Hill Association, and came here to live in Concord.
Sam Staples is best known as the friendly constable who in 1846 arrested Henry David Thoreau and watched over him for one night in the county jail. He was also a real estate developer and auctioneer who developed Lower Bedford Street as a residential neighborhood. As a successor to J.S. Keyes in the post of Superintendent of Public Grounds, Staples took over the management of the new burying ground and Concord's two other cemeteries, the South Burying Ground and the Hill Burying Ground.
This was the Hoar lot. Now let me explain about the word Hoar. It is H-O-A-R, meaning hoar frost in that definition. The big shots of Squire Hoar lived in what is now one of the Concord Academy houses, and a very important man in one of the town fathers, a lawyer, and it was very similar to the Kennedy clan. Every son in the family became a lawyer or a state senator or a representative from their state or a judge, and it was a very high-class family, to the extent that their daughter Elizabeth is here, I think, was engaged to Ralph Waldo Emerson's brother Charles, and this was going to be a very important wedding, combining these two very fine families. But sad to say, Charles died before the wedding took place. Again, consumption, and another sadness for Ralph Waldo himself. He had lost so many of his family, and this brother Charles was very dear to him, and it was one more loss for him. And at the same time, poor Emerson had his very first born child was a little boy that was the joy of his life, and at the age of 5, that little boy died, and is buried near his father in their lot up there. So poor Emerson just had so much sadness in his life. However, Ebenezer Rockwood Hoar, this stone right here, continued the family tradition of fame. He started the Republican Party in Washington, D.C., when the political parties were so important. And he was the secretary. He was the when General Grant was the president of the United States, he chose Ebenezer Rockwood Hoar as his attorney general, and so they lived in Washington for at least 4 years. I'm not sure how much more. And George Frisbee, his brother, in the big tomb at the rear, was another very important man. And on the back of his monument is the famous quotation that you've heard. I had heard it all my life, but I never knew who said it. And it turns out to be George Frisbee Hoar, who said, "Today is better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than today." Always optimistic and looking up. So that, and the Hoar family just sort of died out, the name did, and we just make very sure that people know how it is spelled, so there won't be any funny remarks. One of the most famous families in the pre-Civil War days was the famous Peabody sisters of Salem. Their father was a famous doctor in Boston and did a great many wonderful things, and had these 3 daughters, and they all became famous for one thing or another. Sophia married Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that is a story by itself. The second sister, Mary, married Horace Mann, which is another story all by itself. He became one of the leading teachers and educators of the whole country. And the last sister, Elizabeth, never married anyone. She was a single lady, but she did more in her lifetime to help the education of the children of the country. And her grave says she was Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, which was a famous name in Salem, where they lived. And she was, it says on her grave, a teacher of 3 generations of children and the founder of kindergartens in America. And every humane cause had her sympathy, and many her active aid. She was a very brilliant lady, one of the first feminists who stood up for herself, being a female and not letting people talk her down because she was a woman. She and she was a very strong transcendentalist, had her own bookstore in Concord, and it was used for gatherings of all her transcendental friends would gather at her bookstore in Boston. And she went to Germany and studied how young children were educated. Before the first grade, she was one of the first ones to realize that education should start well before the child went to the first grade in school. And she learned about this German teacher who had started the kindergartens in Germany and came home to America and is credited for having developed the kindergarten system in America. And she had a great deal of influence over the whole transcendental scene. She never had a home of her own, except in Salem, where she was born and brought up. But she often came out here to Concord because her other 2 sisters were here. Sophia, of course, married to Nathaniel Hawthorne, and she would spend a great deal of time with them. But then that meant that she could spend time with the Emersons, which she enjoyed, and with the Thoreaus and so forth. And then her sister Mary also lived here in Concord on Sudbury Road after her husband had died. And she had 2 sons that she was bringing up by herself, and her home is still right on Sudbury Road. So Elizabeth gets a great deal of credit. And again, little momentums of something from nature. This in front of her is her nephew, because these three sisters had a brother, Nathaniel, and Nathaniel Cranch Peabody. The name Cranch is important because Cranch was a Unitarian minister, a very fond friend of Emerson's, and he was kind of an artist, a self-made artist, and loved to do cartoons and so forth. And his wife was Elizabeth, wife of Nathaniel Cranch. So the Cranch, his parents had named him, taken the Cranch name as from one of the old families, friends of the Emersons.
Ruth Robinson Wheeler. For over 40 years, Ruth Wheeler was Concord's principal local historian and the author of countless articles and accounts of the town's historic properties. Her 1967 book, Concord, Climate for Freedom, was the culmination of a life of work devoted to the town's history.
Oh, James Melvin, the three brothers who died, and the fourth survivor returned, and he's buried in Sleepy Hollow. And also the body of his brother John, who was one of the three represented in the monument, because the first one died on the battlefield and just was buried there. And the second one died of his wounds. And then the third one in Andersonville prison, and just thrown into the pit, is the way it's described. He was thrown into the pit. And but the one who still had his body intact was packed in ice and shipped home to Concord. And so he is buried with his brother James. Now, the old grindstone here is a relic, and we all wondered, well, where did it come from? How did it get up here? And of course we all know there was a mill on the mill dam in Concord Center, a grist mill. But these are tremendously big wheels, and we couldn't believe that they were from the grist mill. Come to find out, they were not. They were from a farmer's mill here in Concord. I can't repeat his name, but he was a good Concord farmer and had a big sawmill. And this was probably a gift from his family to the town of Concord as a relic of his generation. And it's an appropriate place to have it in the old burying ground. This grave is dedicated to Sheila Shea. Now, Sheila Shea was no one that most people knew, except we all knew her as a checkout girl at the Stop and Shop of the supermarket in Concord Center. And she was very jolly and happy, but she had cancer. And when she found she had cancer, she knew that she only had 6 months left to live. So she made her own plans, had her own money. She went to the grave cutters and bought her monument, and when they were deciding what to write on it, she gave the statistics of when she was born and when she died in 86. And then she put her pencil down and said, well, when people walk by this years from now and read what is here, they're going to say, who the hell was Sheila Shea? Well, come around the corner. We had to eliminate it from this list because we just didn't think it was quite an Emerson style. Okay, I've thought of the name. Ellery Channing. This very plain, again, you see these people were all they did not go in for a lot of fuss and feathers. The Ellery Channing's stone is this very plain one. Hiding behind the tree. All right, William Ellery Channing. Now, there are two William Ellery Channings, and the senior would be the more important one because he was the man who started the Unitarian denomination of religion, churches. And if you go to Boston, on the Boston Common and Arlington Street, there is the Arlington Street Church, which was the first Unitarian church in Boston. And just across the street is a very handsome black statue of William Ellery Channing the First, who was the leader of the Unitarian denomination. And that sparked the whole city of Boston when from there on the Transcendentalists just took off. But he also had a nephew who was named for him, and this is the nephew, William Ellery Channing. So he is not a junior because it wasn't his son, it was his nephew. And this William Ellery Channing lived here in Concord. He was a poet and a transcendentalist and had a family, several children. But when Thoreau refers to his friend Channing, this is the fellow he's talking about.